When people talk about the deep state in politics, the reaction many people have is to laugh it off. The concept of a deep state sounds like a conspiracy theory. If you're not familiar with the concept of the deep state, the idea is this. The deep state is comprised of those members of the bureaucratic class in the federal government who maintain their jobs from administration to administration, regardless of the party of the president and his chief administrative appointees. Most often we hear about the deep state in terms of the intelligence and diplomatic staff, who have a special access to create the most consternation for any president that they don't like. Often these figures are hard to find in the government because the U.S. government employs staggering numbers of permanent employees. The Catholic Church has a deep state as well, or its equivalent. I'm not talking about the supposedly Catholic nonprofit organizations that all seem to work with abortion advocates, acronym advocates, and population control organizations in general. I'm talking about that ministerial class who finds themselves with the cheeriest of all assignments, whether they seem like innocuous secretarial positions, drivers for priests, or low-level functionary posts in the Vatican, or in services to a nuncio as an otherwise forgettable staff member. Many of these men you see in those positions launched their ecclesial careers in those roles, and would later become auxiliary bishops, archbishops, and cardinals of important dioceses, with the ears of popes and important assignments at the heads of various national bishops' conferences. We know about the overt members of the Lavender Mafia in the Church, those bishops and cardinals who exerted power to recruit and ordain unfit men to the priesthood. But what we know little about is that class of men who represented what a church militant article refers to as the Lavender Underground. We can think of this as that pipeline where the future leaders of the church are pushed through from the ranks of the otherwise mostly anonymous priesthood. In secular politics, the political pipeline is that process or system where local activists and low-level elected officials work their way up through the party structure into the highest offices in the United States. If you look at the profiles of any member of the U.S. Senate, you will see a career of ladder climbing that hints at others having seen their potential and helped them along the way into becoming the household names many of them are today. A perfect example of this is Senator Bernie Sanders, who started his political career as the mayor of Burlington, Vermont, and then managed to get elected to the U.S. House of Representatives for a quarter of a century before becoming a U.S. Senator. Prior to any of that, he was an activist. Along the way, he had the help of other activists who saw his potential and helped guide him to where he is now. In the Catholic Church, we have the same thing. An example of this is that of Cardinal Cupich, friend of this channel. Cupich is a ladder climber of the sort that is reminiscent of politicians of all stripes. He's a consummate careerist, and Cupich was once an otherwise invisible priest in Washington, D.C., working as secretary to a nuncio in the 1980s. Yes, during the Reagan administration, to give you an idea of how long ago we're talking about. In a piece for Church Militant, Dr. Christopher Mannion, Ph.D., recounts his experience working as a low-level staffer for an American senator in Washington, D.C. At the time, he became the face for that senator and for several of his colleagues for religious leaders not happy with the Reagan administration's policies in Central America. Reagan had taken a hard line against leftist governments and revolutionary groups in the Americas, and he was not terribly interested in doing anything other than supporting the client states of the United States in their conflicts against groups like the Sandinistas. At that time, liberation theology was rampant in the church in South and Central America, and many priests and bishops were sympathetic to their South American brothers and their love for that condemned ideology. At least, they were sympathetic if they had the right politics, for many bishops in South America were actually opposed to the leftist ideology rampant in the priesthood, and often the North American bishops would ignore the pleas for help from their more orthodox South American cousins. Remember, their Orthodox South American cousins were often getting murdered by some of these governments. Dr. Mannion, at the time working for that senator, had had a conversation with one of those more Orthodox cardinals and decided to pay the nuncio a visit. Instead of meeting with the nuncio, he was told the nuncio was out of the office. He met a young Father Blaise Cupich, who listened to his story with a quote, stony-faced expression, end quote, and then promised to relay his message about the woes of the cardinal he was speaking on behalf of to the nuncio. Later, Dr. Mannion came to the conclusion that Cupich, in fact, did not tell the nuncio a thing. Not surprising to us these days, to be honest. But the immediate consequence was that his senator was no longer visited by representatives of the U.S. Bishops' Conference in their lobbying activity. Very curious, right? Later, Dr. Mannion heard from a now deceased archbishop that in fact he had heard nothing about the plight of the South American cardinals. Cupich had not passed a single word on to the nuncio, a clear violation of his duties. I'm recounting this story because it connects the dots for the Lavender Mafia and illustrates how figures tie together. At the time, the head of the U.S. Bishops' Conference was none other than Cardinal Seamless Garment himself, Joseph Bernardin of Chicago, along with Father Robert Lynch, who later, as bishop in Florida, had to pay off a man out of court for sexual harassment claims he had leveled against Bishop Lynch. Lynch, at the time, was Bernardin's secretary at the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. Recounting on how this probably worked, I'll quote the article Dr. Mannion submitted to Church Militant on this. Instead, I think he got on the phone to Lynch at the conference as soon as I walked out of the nuncio's door, warning him, keep clear of this guy, he's trouble. So what if I worked for the most pro-life senator on Capitol Hill? That wasn't nearly so important to the sodomite syndicate as pushing their left-wing agenda. Recall that Cupich had this to say about the allegations made by Vigano and the McCarrick scandal last year.
The Pope has a bigger agenda. He's got to get on with other things, of talking about the environment and protecting migrants and carrying on the work of the church. We're not going to go down a rabbit hole on this.
The secular political agenda is far more important to the Lavender Mafia than almost anything else is, including the lives and well-being of cardinals in other parts of the world. It was true in the 1980s and is still true today. At the recent Bishop Sex Seminar, or whatever it was called, recall that Cardinal Cupich made sure that everyone understood that the abuse of children was different from consensual adult activity, which should be handled separately according to him. And by separately, Cupich meant probably never, because there has been no movement on ferreting out the network of priests and bishops who live the rainbow lifestyle in the aftermath of the McCarrick scandals. In his first testimony in August of 2018, Archbishop Vigano spoke of other men who were just like McCarrick, specifically naming Cardinal Kevin Farrell, when he said the following, quoting from Vigano's August testimony. Cardinal Kevin Farrell, who was recently interviewed by the media, also said that he didn't have the slightest idea about the abuses committed by McCarrick. Given his tenure in Washington, Dallas, and now Rome, I think no one can honestly believe him. I don't know if he was ever asked if he knew about Maciel's crimes. If he were to deny this, would anybody believe him given that he occupied positions of responsibility as a member of the Legionaries of Christ? End quote. That denial was made in spite of Farrell having lived with McCarrick for 6 years. Farrell obviously knew at least a little bit about McCarrick's activities, in the same way he obviously knew about Marcel Maciel's crimes, because he served that as the pervert's personal assistant. Do you see the pattern yet? The worst figures in the church in recent history actively recruited and kept close to them men who would keep their secrets, control the flow of information, and would helped them get into positions of power and influence. Which brings us to this. The St. Gallen Mafia was led by Cardinal Martini until he died in 2012. The Lavender Mafia and the St. Gallen Mafia have been thought to have been separate bodies, but James Grine revealed that Ted McCarrick was the linchpin that connected the two groups together. Prior to his death in 2012, Martini called himself an anti-pope, and not anti-pope with an I at the end, but anti-pope with an E. One who would be a, quote, precursor and preparer, end quote, for a new pope who would bring about, quote, radical change in a tired and pompous church, end quote. As a quick aside, if you're not familiar with the St. Gallen Mafia, LifeSite has a list of the known figures from a book one of them published that outed most of its members. Quoting that article for the sake of everyone being on the same page, quote, Bishop Führer, who was Bishop of St. Gallen, Switzerland, from 1995 until 2005, was, together with Martini, the organizer of the St. Gallen Mafia. The group of progressive cardinals included Cardinals Achille Silvestrini, Basil Hume, Walter Casper, Carl Lehmann, Godfrey Daniels, Cormac Murphy O'Connor, and Audrys Juzak Bakis, who were collectively discontented with the pontificate of Pope John Paul II, and then, after his death, they unsuccessfully tried to get Jorge Bergoglio elected at the 2005 conclave. Significantly, the group met in St. Gallen on a yearly basis exactly during the time when Bishop Führer was the Bishop of St. Gallen. thus being able to host their annual meetings." End quote. We can add to that list of names Ted McCarrick. Returning to Cardinal Martini, just prior to his death, he published a book called Night Conversations with Cardinal Martini, which is a weird name for a book written by a cardinal, by the way, which LifeSite describes as a blueprint for how change could be effected in the Church regarding her teachings on sexuality, marriage, contraception, sin, hell, the male-only priesthood, and many other things. LifeSite put the statements of Martini's alongside things done and said by Pope Francis to illustrate how Martini and the St. Gallen Mafia coordinated to push their agenda. I'm going to read to you some of these statements. Again, these are from the LifeSite article, and these are verbatim quotes. Martini wrote about sexual sins that, in the past, the Church probably said too much about the sixth commandment. Sometimes silence would have been better. Pope Francis, in his early pontificate, said, "We cannot insist only on issues related to abortion, gay marriage, and the use of contraceptive methods." For another example, Martini wrote about the destruction of souls who would otherwise go to hell. Quote, "I hope that sooner or later God redeems everyone. I can't imagine how Hitler or a murderer who has abused children can be with God. It's easier for me to think that such people are simply extinguished. But perhaps in the other world God has new possibilities. Yes, there is a hell, but nobody knows if anyone is in there." End quote. Pope Francis said about this, quote, "They are not punished. Those who do not repent and cannot therefore be forgiven disappear. Hell does not exist. The disappearance of sinful souls exists." End quote. That quote has never been denied by Pope Francis. In another example, Martini wrote on not judging homosexuals, quote, "Among people I know there are homosexual couples, people who are highly regarded and public-minded. I have never been asked, and it would never occur to me, to judge them." End quote. Pope Francis said about this, quote, "If someone is gay and is searching for the Lord and has goodwill, then who am I to judge him?" End quote. That LifeSite article goes on to recount things we already knew, like how his advisors said on the record that Francis intends to change the Church in ways that no future pope will be able to undo. We see that plan playing out before our eyes. The thing about this is this. We know they won't be successful in the long term. Most of us have this sense that things in the world are heading towards something awful happening. For those of us who are awake and aware of the Fatima message, we know that a physical chastisement is almost certainly coming, one that will certainly rid us of these bad bishops and many of the bad priests. What that will look like is anyone's guess, as we don't know anything about the future. Some of the prophecies I've published here might, and I repeat, might, provide insight into what's coming. In the end, we do need to stand firm and pray that this mess comes to an end sooner rather than later. Souls are on the line. Thank you for listening and for your support. If you want to support my work, there are options in the description of this video. I ask that people continue to pray and do acts of penance for the liberation and exaltation of the Church. I'm Anthony Stein. Ave Maria.